Most cast-on methods don't have a matching bind-off. In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate a bind-off method that matches the commonly used long-tail cast-on. Now, I have previously demonstrated a different bind-off method that produces the same result, but today's method is much easier and less prone to error. If you'd like to jump to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section of the video. So the bind-off method that I'm going to demonstrate today produces this edge that you see up here in dark blue. And what you'll notice is that it matches the edge I have down here in the bottom, which was the method I used to cast on. So this was the long tail cast on, standard long tail cast on. And so this is a bind-off that matches it. With the working yarn, you're going to need to measure off about 4 times as much yarn as this fabric is wide. So you're going to measure that off and create a long tail that you're then going to thread onto a yarn needle. Now, if you have a very wide piece of fabric, you really don't want to measure off more than about a yard, because you're going to have to pull this strand of yarn through every single stitch. And if you have a very long strand of yarn, it's going to get tangled up, and it's also going to get worn out as you go through stitch after stitch after stitch. So you can join a new piece of yarn partway through the bind off if you need to. So if you're binding off something like a blanket or something that's just quite wide, you really don't want to measure off more than a yard at a time for your tail. There are really only 2 steps to this bind off. The first one is to enter the second stitch from the front. So you're entering as if to knit through that second stitch. So you insert your yarn needle right through that stitch and you pull the yarn through. Now on the first stitch that's on the needle, you're going to enter as if to purl. So you're coming in just like if you were purling a stitch, and you pull that yarn through and you let that stitch off the needle. Now you're going to repeat what you just did. You're going to go through the second stitch as if to knit, and you're going to come through that first stitch as if to purl. And if it helps you remember to make sure it comes off the needle, you can let it come off now and then pull the yarn through. So always through the second stitch as if to knit, and when it comes through the first stitch as if to purl, that one comes off the needle. Now, when you have this final stitch left, you're going to enter as if to knit, and then you're going to come under this strand right here in the front and bring your needle under it. And that's going to create a little slip knot ending for it. Now, when you first look at this, this is in stockinette, so it's rolling. You might find that these purl bumps in back are sticking up above the line. You can work with this as you wash and block it to kind of pull that edge up. But the other thing that you might find that you need to do is to take out this might end up being looser than you really wanted, and you might want to take some of that slack out. So what you can do is take your knitting needle and you can come along the edge, you can pull out some of that slack going along each one of these and take some of that slack out. Now you don't have to take any of that slack out if you don't want to, but you can in order to adjust that edge. I've cut the yarn so it's not going to be long enough, I don't think, to do the whole bind off, so that I'll show you how to join a new piece of yarn in case you didn't estimate the yarn correctly, or in case you're doing something that's very large in circumference or large in width, where you really don't want to use more than, say, a yard at a time. You start in the same exact way. You insert as if to knit through the second stitch and as if to purl through the first and let that one come off the needle. And you continue in this same way for the entire round. Okay, now I'm getting to the point where I'm thinking that my tail is getting a little bit too short. So what I'm going to do on this is I'm going to go through that second stitch as if to knit, pull the yarn through, and I'm going to pull my yarn needle out of the yarn. Now I'm going to thread my additional length of yarn. So I've gone through that second stitch as if to knit. I'm going to come through this first one as if to purl like I would normally. And I want to make sure that I'm not going to pull this out all the way. I want to make sure I leave that tail there. So I could put a temporary knot in between the two. I'd take the knot out later just to provide tension so that I don't pull any tails through. But I don't need to do that. So now I can continue on. I'm going to go through that one as if to knit. And come up this one as if to purl and pull through. And then I will continue on to this last stitch. So I have this one remaining stitch left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to go through this first stitch of the round as if to knit. I'm going to lift this up a little bit here. I'm going to go through that stitch right there as if to knit. So that's coming out from behind. And now I'm going to go through this one as if to purl and let that one come off the needle. So now I've completed the round. I've joined the end of the round to the beginning of the round, and now I can weave in that yarn tail. And then the two tails that I have here in the back, I'm going to just want to correct the tension on them to make sure it's the same on all of them. And what I'll do here is I'll cross them in opposite directions. And I will weave one of them in through the backs of the stitches going down over here, and I'll weave the other one in coming down over here so that they are crossed in the back. Socks are knit so that they are smaller than the leg that they are surrounding, and which requires the fabric to stretch. And it's at the top of the sock where the fabric has to stretch the most. So it's really important, regardless of which direction you're knitting, cuff down or toe up, that this particular edge be as stretchy, that the edge is as stretchy as the fabric is. And so I use this bind-off method on this sock right here, and you can see that the edge is just as stretchy as the rest of the fabric. This is a fingerless mitt that I knit where I had a couple of reasons why I wanted to use this bind-off technique. One was that I'd used a long tail cast on for the starting edge, and so both edges were going to be showing, and so I thought it would be nice if they matched each other. But the other was that I wanted something stretchier than the standard chain bind-off for up here, and that is because for this particular mitt, it's a fingerless mitt, but I wanted to knit it as long or almost as long as a regular mitten so that when it was worn outside, it could cover the fingers completely. If it was necessary, that this could be folded back very easily without any issue so that the fingers could become exposed. A standard chain bind-off, it's just a little bit too tight to make that work, especially with this really chunky yarn. In knitting, there are always multiple ways to get to the same end point, and there are always advantages and disadvantages to any given technique. There are a couple of advantages to the half-hitch or seam stitch bind-off. It's stretchy and it matches the long tail cast on. The disadvantage is that because it's a sewn bind-off, it can't be unzipped like other bind-off methods. When selecting a bind-off for your project, consider the different qualities and characteristics you want your bind-off to have. It's likely that more than one bind-off could work well for your project, and the choice of which method to use will come down to personal preference. If you're unsure about how well a technique will work in your project, try it out in a swatch and see what you think. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.